Good afternoon to all of you. So our program continue with the theme of the Silk Road. This afternoon we are having with us an expert on the Middle East business with more than 20 years of editorial experience of business and current affairs. He rejoined the CNN to take up the new role presenting CNN Marketplace Middle East, having worked as an anchor and correspondent for the network from 1999 until 2000, including anchoring the London-based business show World Business Today. As a journalist, Mr. Defterios brings more than 2 decades of experience, having covered some of the biggest stories of our time. That includes the Gulf War, the fall of Berlin Wall, the World Trade Center bombings, and many, many more. Without any further ado, let me introduce to you an experienced journalist with whom I feel quite intimidated.
You shouldn't. You'll find out why.
I want the presence of a CNN and yourself. So I will do my best today, and please help me as well. And I leave the floor to you.
Thanks.
You are welcome to Multaqa, and you are welcome to Abu Dhabi Book Fair.
Thanks very much, Radha. That's very kind of you for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. If we can bring my PowerPoint slide up, Ellie, that would be great. Great, and you can take me to the next slide as well, make sure it works. Perfect. As Radha gave a kind introduction of my career, actually I started in CNN in 1992 and was in and out of different regions for the last 25 years, having started initially with public broadcasting service and a program called the Nightly Business Report, so the equivalent of the BBC in the United States. I just put this slide up to give you a sense of as being a real-time practitioner of the Silk Road. I just have 25 years of coverage in Washington, New York, Los Angeles, Rome, London, and in Abu Dhabi since 2011. But I have a passion for the Silk Road, and so when Asma Al-Sadiq Al-Mutawa invited me the last couple of years to come, I said, if I don't put it in the context as an author of books, but a real practitioner of the Silk Road, because I've had a chance to travel the world, and there's some amazing trends that are emerging. But I've been on location in both the silk and spice routes, which I'm going to talk about today, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Russia, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, as you can see here, taking us down to Southeast Asia to Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. And this, particularly the silk and spice routes, is something that's evolved in the last decade of my coverage. And there's some incredibly strong parallels between hard power today and the soft power that we see taking place as well. And I'll talk a little bit later about that. I sat into 4 or 5 discussions at the Literary Salon in 2017, and we often hear discussions about the silk routes and the spice routes, but nobody actually looks at them and what they really mean for commerce. So everybody has a fabled belief of what the Silk Road is all about, but actually the Silk routes are 5 to 6 routes, depending on how you define them. That here is in red. This is a map that goes back to the 1700s, and that's why we have Arabia and Persia, India, and China in that context. And as you can see here, the spice routes extend to the East African Horn and carries us all the way down to Southeast Asia as well. So the Silk routes in red, and the spice routes in blue. It's very interesting with Islam being transferred from the Middle East to Southeast Asia because of the travelers on the spice route. And when you go into Indonesia, Malaysia, and even to Singapore, their affection for the financial bonds today based on the religious bonds that stretch back more than 1,500 years. So that's the context that we're speaking. I'll primarily focus on the Silk routes today, but I'll intertwine some of the thoughts on the spice routes. It's interesting when we talk about these routes and the different explorers that we've discussed in the last week here at the Literary Salon. Of course, I have a special affection for Alexander the Great because of my family being Greek on both sides. My wife is Italian, her father is Greek. So going back to 356 BC, or before the Common Era, to 326 the travels of Alexander the Great, Marco Polo from 1254 to 1324, and his 24 years of traveling through the Silk Route territories, and of course the Middle Eastern at heart that I am, having been covering the region for 20 years, Ibn Battuta from 1325 to 1354, his travels and explorations. As I said to Asma when she invited me to do this, many people get stuck in the weeds on the literature and going back 4 or 5 centuries or 1,500 years in the travels of the silk and spice routes today. What I think is most interesting, having been covering the region for 25 years, but being based in Abu Dhabi for the last 6 years, are the new bilateral relationships that are emerging here, specifically between the UAE and China, and the UAE in India, and now the UAE stretching to Southeast Asia. And if you look at the papers today, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed yesterday launched this soft power committee yesterday. And I think it's fitting. If you look in the papers today, Soft Power Council to elevate the nation's position in the future. So this is where hard power, trade, economics, and resources, and we're a natural resource-based economy diversifying, dovetails with soft power. And I saw this on a recent trip that I went to in China, where Saudi Arabia and China are exchanging soft power, which leads to good hard power in terms of business relationships in the future.
So what do you make out of this? Do you feel, it looks like we are going, this is history re-emerging again.
Yeah.
We're going back, learning on what had been there before, centuries ago, and coming back to it and see what was the impact before and the possibility of applying it today?
Sure, it's a fantastic question. First and foremost, what I think has changed in the last decade, particularly in the last 5 years alone, the focus here used to be tilting to the West, and its compass being the United States, Washington, relationships with the UK, with Brussels. In the last 10 years, and accelerated in the last 5 years, there's been a defined tilt to the East when it comes to geopolitical alliances, when it comes to India, China, and Russia, and economic alliances because of the rise of both India and China. What I think is very fascinating here with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you see a similar policy in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and particularly the kingdom right now.
And this is to diversify, or there had been some shortcoming from previous relation, or both today are going at the same boat with the same speed?
It's to both again. It's interesting. I think that they thought even investment-wise, for example, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority or the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, it was too tilted to the West. They see the growth of India and China today, so they want to tap into that growth. But this is a very symbiotic relationship, and I'll bring up the numbers a little bit later. Natural resources exports, particularly when it comes to oil, but using the expertise and the size of the markets for India and China. So export to India and China, what expertise India and China brings into here, and the same thing for Southeast Asia. So it's a much more symbiotic relationship that you would find with the West, which has been primarily outbound investment. This is a dual exchange of both resources and expertise at the same time. I mentioned to Asma, I think it's worthwhile taking note of the authors that we've seen in the last decade who've made an impact in this area of the Silk Road. I think the most significant one is Professor Peter Frankopan. He's the author of The Silk Roads, a new history of the world. It's quite thick. It's a weighty read, but a very worthwhile read. To the point of my discussion today, I wanted to make sure I focused on the modern aspects of it. So I picked up information from a latter chapter from Peter Frankopan. We're seeing the signs of the world's center of gravity shifting and back to where it lay for the millennia. So the very point you brought up, because these continents have a relationship that stretches back better than 1,500 years, they feel extremely comfortable re-engaging again. So it's a re-engagement. It's not starting from scratch. What we're witnessing are the birth pains of a region that once dominated the intellectual, cultural, and economic landscape, and which is now re-emerging. I would suggest it's re-emerging in a very big way. Now, to my point, I think it's a very interesting point. I would invite you to go take a look at it. The center of gravity is shifting, and there was actually a study done by Danny Quah, the London School of Economics, about the center of gravity shift. In 1980, now think about the compass of the world, where the economic might was of the world in 1980, because of the growth of the United States and the size of the European Union, the compass of the world's economy was sitting mid-Atlantic, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in 1980. That shifted to, because of the growth of India and China, the compass of that world shifted to Helsinki in 2008, right? The center of gravity. By 2050, that compass will sit between India and China. So the world is definitely tilting to the east right now, and very strategically, the UAE is focused on this growth from here to China, India being a central focus, and then tilting all the way down to Southeast Asia. So editorially on CNN, I call it the arc of growth. It's the arc of growth from North Africa through the Middle East, stretching to South Asia, to China, and that arc tilts all the way down to Southeast Asia, if that makes sense for you. So it has profound implications going forward, and you're witnessing this on almost a daily basis here in the UAE. So I want basically for you to pay attention to what's coming out almost on a daily basis about these new relationships that are taking place in the world today. But the profound implication, I think now, and you saw this in the election of Donald Trump in November and taking office in January, is that we see two very divided camps in the world today. One that's embracing globalization and ones that are throwing up barriers to trade, or I suggest that's cocooning. So we had a population that was very unhappy with globalization. I covered the final World Trade Organization trade round, 1991, 1992. It created fantastic growth in India and China, but the competition was far too intense for many states of the European Union and clearly for the United States. So they're going to try to dial that back and find a happy medium. You've heard Donald Trump talking about throwing out the NAFTA agreement. He said the South Koreans will protect them with missiles, but he wants to tear up the trade agreement with South Korea as well. So we're in a period of dislocation, and for that reason, and very senior sources that I speak to in the UAE say we have to remain more globalized than ever before. So while others are starting to cocoon, the leaders of the world, like Xi Jinping of China, and His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid or Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed here, and Sheikh Khalifa, are saying we're a globalized economy. We only survive if we stay open. So there's two very distinct camps that we see today, and it's another reason we see the Middle East states embracing the countries of India and China as Europe and the US begin to close.
But to what extent global powers, in fear of what might emerge or come out of this global economy and global tendency from countries like the UAE, will challenge this process and might not be satisfied with it, try to diversify it, challenge it, or put some obstacle? Do you think this global approach towards India and China from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries will continue to be smooth and supported and grow, or it will be resisted by other global powers like the new administration of Donald Trump?
Well, I think what Donald Trump said as a person on the campaign trail and what Donald Trump suggests today as president are two very different personalities. Even the person that entered office and gave a speech on Inauguration Day was accusing China of being a currency manipulator, and now after Xi Jinping has visited Mar-a-Lago, they've had conversations with Japan as well with Prime Minister Abe. The tone has changed dramatically, but it's very unpredictable. So to be very blunt about the conversation, I think it's extremely wise for the Middle East to hedge its bets. And because it sits at the crossroads of East and West, it can tilt both East and West and balance out its geopolitical relationships. And I would even argue with the relationships that we have with Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways, it forges new ties going into Africa. So it used to be Air France and British Airways that controlled the links to Africa. Clearly today, that's Emirates Airline, Etihad, and Qatar Airways leading those relationships. And I also call it UAE Inc. And I'll talk about Africa a little bit later because I don't want to get away from the Silk Roads. But the forging of the clustering of activities, the airlines, the trade port, the hotel groups, and the sovereign funds that go into different regions of the world that set up relationships are extremely impressive. So you asked me about globalization. I have a short video report that's worth listening. I hope does everybody speak very fluent English? Okay, you're okay, perfect. I want to roll a 3-minute report And you have, yeah, I'm not sure if you'll hear the audio on the report, but let's see. This is a report that I did out of Beijing about a month and a half ago, and showing exactly what you were talking about. The United States starting to cocoon, and China wanting to step up to the world stage and be the leader of globalization. Let's see if this will play. Sorry, it's here, but let's just make sure it plays. Turn the audio a little bit. Audio. China and the Middle East are growing closer and closer, and standing here in Beijing, it's easier to see why. As China's economy continues to grow, so too does its demand for energy. It purchases more than half its oil from the Middle East. Trade with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE represents 70% of all Sino-Arab trade. But it's not just about oil. China has overtaken the U.S. as the largest exporter to the Gulf. Recent reports suggest China will be the region's most important economic partner by 2020. It's all part of Beijing's strategy to expand its reach to the Middle East and beyond. This as the new Trump administration focuses on domestic policy and actually trying to protect U.S. industry. The U.S. and China appear to be heading in opposite directions when it comes to trade. On one side, Donald Trump is pursuing an America First policy and threatening to slap tariffs on Chinese goods.
Our goal as a nation must be to rely less on imports and more on products made here in the USA.
反对。
On the other, Xi Jinping wants to be the globalist, telling those at the World Economic Forum not to fall prey to populism. Ben Ziffendorfer, author of The New Silk Road, says this is best illustrated by Xi's latest policy blueprint called One Belt, One Road.
Xi Jinping is committed to the policy and will continue to not only demonstrate but back it up with favorable policies that support trade and investment ties with the region.
The aim is to link 66 countries from China heading west and south, a revival of the old Silk routes by modernizing roads, rails, airports, and much more. Xi's master plan is being viewed as a means of boosting China's influence by promoting growth. It's already being compared to the U.S. Marshall Plan, in fact, after World War II. Nearly $500 billion of projects have been approved, up nearly 50% in the last year alone. Dubai's giant port operator, DP World, says 3/4 of its growth today comes from emerging markets. But poor infrastructure and bureaucracy remain huge obstacles.
Intermodal connectivity is very important. So you get rail, you get air, you get road, and you get sea. The more of them you get, then more efficiency will be achieved in our business.
Smoother commerce translates into more access for Chinese products, from cars to industrial lighting. One Belt, One Road also helps complete a strategy after years of planning to connect China through the Middle East to the African continent.
It's often unrecognized that the Middle East is a springboard for China into Africa. Chinese companies are setting up in Dubai using the Emirate as a services hub for trade in East Africa, North Africa, even South Africa.
And one which allows the Chinese president to be positioned as the globalist, when his U.S. counterpart is sending the opposite message. Great.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Pretty interesting, right?
Absolutely interesting.
Yeah. Now, so what's tucked into that conversation? I can go on for an hour about this, but there's some sub-themes there. Take a look after this session today when you get a chance to look at the One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road connects 66 countries, including China, all the way through the Middle East and down to Africa. It's built around the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. We had quite a robust debate over the last 3 years because it's challenging the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, both of which are based in Washington, D.C. The AIIB is based in Beijing. It's starting with about $100 billion worth of capital. So it'll be quite powerful. And then when I went to Beijing, I was there for a month between February and March. And I thought, why is China moving so aggressively to set up the AIIB? China's growing 6.9% today. It's terrific. It's probably a little bit lower than that, but they've been able to maintain at least 6.5%. China cannot grow on the manufacturing base much faster. They need to shift to create domestic demand. So in order for the industry of China to remain relevant, to keep the Chinese employed, to stop the massive migration into the major cities, they need to export. So the best way is for them to finance major projects with $3 trillion of its sovereign wealth, set up big road, rail, construction projects to be able to export their steel and other products on the Silk Road. So the Silk Road is absolutely essential to China's future. So this whole idea of them connecting from China through Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, into the Middle East, you heard this will be the most important trading partner of the UAE by 2020. It's starting today, but by 2020, it's going to be their most important trading partner already. So this tilt has already taken place, is what my suggestion is.
The fascinating part of this is that history is being revived, but in a mega way.
Yes.
Before it was traditional transportation system, it was individuals, traders, and businessmen. Today it's government, it's the states with all its power, it's new roads, it's new transportation system. So whatever we had seen, the effect of this road in the past, we can multiply that 100 times.
Yeah, at least, I agree. The other, I mentioned that Peter Frankopan's book, I interviewed Ben Ziffendorf there. He's the author of The New Silk Roads. It's a much easier read, not as thick, but it focuses on the modern day Silk Road. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2009. He's a fantastic former UK diplomat based in Beijing today and has a tremendous understanding of what's taking place between China and the Middle East in particular. There's a few other things that we should pay attention to here. Do you remember the great game of the 19th century spilling into the 20th century? The great game was the battle over natural resources in Central Asia between Russia and Britain. The great game today is played by China, India, and the Middle East over Central Asia. The US is from the outside looking in and trying to shape that policy, whether it's with Iran, whether it's with Iraq, maintain ties with Saudi Arabia. But the biggest fear in Washington today about the great game is the influence that China will have over Central Asia going forward. Then you have players at the heart of the Silk Road, which I think is fascinating as well. Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan has been in power since they became an independent state. He was a Communist Party boss there beforehand, so he's been in power for better than 30 years. Particularly close to the UAE, by the way, has a palace here off the shore of Abu Dhabi, so very close to His Highness Sheikh Khalifa and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. He understands the art of the Silk Road and balancing the great game. There's 2 pipelines going into China with oil and gas. He has railroads going into Russia, distributed as oil and gas. And he has a share in the BTC pipeline, Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan. So Baku in Azerbaijan, Tbilisi in Georgia, Ceyhan in Turkey, and he distributes to Western Europe as well. So one state with natural resources, mainly oil and gas, but incredible uranium supplies and nickel supplies, balancing Russia, balancing China, and balancing Europe. It's not an easy thing to do, but the winners on the Silk Route know how to balance those out. The other journalist I saw, that if you want to look about the natural resources and read into it, The New Great Game, Blood, Oil in Central Asia is by Lutz Kliverman. She wrote that back in 2004 when oil prices started to recover and move on to $100 a barrel. If you want to focus on that, I can always email people afterwards. But it's The New Great Game, Blood and Oil in Central Asia, to the point of Kazakhstan. The other one I think you should pay attention to are the mineral resources of Iran. Iran has the largest combined oil and gas reserves. I know the relations here have often been strained because of the military activity of Iran, but it sits on $1 trillion of mineral wealth, and so does Afghanistan. So they'll become more important when it comes to the future of the Silk Road. Very quickly, because I don't want to bore you with technicalities, but I think it's worth you paying attention to a few other organizations that have been formulated. One is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a counterparty to NATO, if you will, but in a smaller way. Formed in 2001, consists of Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and India will join next year.
This is changing. This is totally like new allies.
Yeah, new allies.
New allies.
So Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India will join next year, And again, that's why you see closer relationships between the Middle East and the SCO going forward. Even the Eurasia Free Zone has 5 member states right now. Nobody ever talks about it, but it's Russia's approach to control that. So it has a trade agreement with 5 states dealing in Central Asia with Russia today. We'll see if it's expanded to include India and China. I talked about China's Xi Jinping and his One Belt, One Road plan. It's a little bit easier for China to engage everybody when it comes to trade because they have $3 trillion to be able to invest. Because they have to circulate their money, they're putting a lot of money here to cement their ties on the Silk Road.
To what extent this big amount is affecting really the price of currencies in the world, especially the dollars?
The price of?
Of currencies, the value of the currency in the market, especially the dollars?
Well, China remains extremely dependent on the US dollar because it owns about 35 to 40% of the US bond market. It also owns about the same level of bonds in Europe as well. So China needs a stable US dollar and it needs a stable euro. However, the renminbi will be more widely traded, the Chinese currency, in years to come. And you'll see even the sovereign funds of the Middle East put more money into renminbi in the future as it becomes more widely traded. There's even deals today being done between China and Africa in renminbi. It's no longer only in US dollars. You're based in Africa, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. I talked about the relationship with India as well. I have a short video clip with an interview I did with His Excellency Mohammed Anwar Gargash, who's the Minister of State of Foreign Affairs. And it was right before he took a trip to India. So the UAE first focused on China, and then as that relationship on the Silk Road and its Silk Road strategy took form in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they moved to India. So let's see if Anwar Mohammed Gargash, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs.
Oil is part of it, an important part of it.
And he starts on oil and we build it out.
Other layers, as you mentioned, the UAE is becoming
bring the
also
volume
more
up again?
attractive as a Middle Eastern, center of trade and investment, etc.
In fact, I don't want to be cute, but it's almost like a don't ask, don't tell. When you trade with the East, you respect their political structures and vice versa. Is this the advantage where you have an understanding that the domestic political structure doesn't interfere with trade and the bigger geopolitical context?
No, I don't think this is a driving force. I mean, these are different cultures. They sort of behave politically in different ways, but this is not a replacement towards your engagement with the West. It's just, a matter of fact that the world is becoming, as I mentioned, multi-centered, and as a result, you need to be successful in your dealing with the West, and you need to also look east and sort of cultivate, multi-layered relationship that's mutually beneficial.
Now, one would suggest, because of what we see out of Washington or the UK, that it's more vital to engage with the East because of the protectionist tendencies we're seeing today.
When you sort of build a strategic relationship, East or West, you need to look really beyond what is, I would say, in vogue. And as a result, I think you're concerned about dealing with a partner because of a certain, I would say, certain populism in their politics, etc. But I think these things come and go, and a strategic relationship ought to, sort of look beyond that.
In fact, this is one of the most globalized economies, very much in the Singaporean model. Do you worry about the cocooning that we see taking place in Europe and the United States?
Well, naturally, I think in 2008, when we saw a global recession, the UAE was one of the Arab countries that was more affected than other Arab countries because the UAE was more globalized. So definitely, we benefit more from a more, I would say, open trade regime, openness in investment, etc. And we would stand to be challenged by any sort of receding climate there. But as I said, this is, I would say, a cycle. You need to sort of retool and understand that this is a sort of world that you're part of. And as a result, We're still very, very sure that the UAE is one of the most attractive Middle Eastern centers in terms of its economy and in terms of its other potential.
Okay, so Anwar Mohammed Gargash said it extremely clearly. He can balance the relationship between the West and the East. You can see the mindset that they have here. So I would just invite you to look very carefully about the relationship today. The UAE has been so shrewd of cementing the trade relationships with India, for example. $70 billion of re-exports coming in bilateral trade between India and the UAE alone. Jebel Ali is handling two-thirds of all traffic in the Gulf states and the outside world comes through Jebel Ali. It's been a major force. Khalifa Port is an extremely impressive facility that they built here in Abu Dhabi. So I think they're going to cement that relationship going forward. A few other things to watch out for, again, looking back to 2005, 2006, when King Abdullah, the late great King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, took his first trip overseas after taking the throne in 2005. Early 2006, he didn't go to the United States. He didn't go to Europe. He went to China. He was invited by Hu Jintao. That set the relationship for a number of different things, including oil trade. I was there when they opened up a refinery on the Red Sea. China and Sinopec and CNPC have a 50-50 joint partnership with Saudi Aramco. They produce 400,000 barrels a day of oil on the Red Sea today. It locks in China as a Saudi customer for the next 50 years. It was very strategic, came out of that meeting in 2005, and that was just the start of bilateral relations, bilateral trade, and we see the same thing taking place today with the UAE. Now, at the beginning, I talked about this article, Soft Power Council, to elevate the nation's position. It can't all be just, let's export oil, we'll take Chinese construction companies, yes, you invest in us, you use Jebel Ali. There has to be a common cultural understanding. The cultural understanding is taking place, and I was so surprised when I went to China. I was sitting in the back of a taxi and I picked out a magazine and it had an article about an exhibit that was taking place at the Chinese National Museum. And it was on the Silk Road and the relationship between the Middle East and China. It's being sponsored by Saudi Aramco. Quite interesting in itself. Tells you a lot about, let's form the cultural ties. There's a Chinese school here in Abu Dhabi. Very smart, Chinese language schools. Very clever to be able to train the next generation of Emiratis and expats in fluent Mandarin, because you're going to solidify your relationship for the future, right? I want to show you a report on that exhibit and what hard and soft power looks like. Do we have the audio up? Because it's important. This is the curator spoke Mandarin and we translated him. And then we can take questions from the floor. Okay? So these tools date back how long, Shenli?
About 1 million years ago.
That's quite a collection.
Yeah. That's great.
We can see many exhibits are related to historical dialogue, including business relations and religious understanding. It presents an extensive link between the Arabic world and the outside.
So this is the influence of Egypt over the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah.
In the ancient Arabian Peninsula, there was not only the Silk Road, but also the Spice Road, the Chinese Porcelain Road, and many other prosperous business and trade roads, which went from Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Mediterranean Sea area, the Mesopotamian plain, and even from ancient India and ancient China.
This is a perfect example of what is called soft power, using culture to improve understanding, business, and trade. The exhibit is sponsored by the oil giant, Saudi Aramco. Okay, pretty fascinating. We were very busy. I wasn't expecting to do that story in China, but I said, this is such a good story. And our Mandarin producer in Beijing said, Mr. Defterios would like to come in and do this exhibit. And they said, if he can come back in 4 weeks. But I didn't have 4 weeks to come back, so we did it at the same time.
It's really fascinating. Yes, it's
Yeah.
really fascinating. And to see that even, I would like just to go back to one sentence that His Excellency Anwar Gargash said with regard to the recession of 2008.
Yes.
And the insight that had provided for the need
Yes.
to diversify and be more global, and how that is now being supported. We are not starting from scratch here. There is history, long history in place, and let's merge the two powers together, the soft one and the hard one. And I think this is amazing. What we will see between now and 2050, I think is going to change the map of...
Completely. Well, you saw the economic tilt in the study by Danny Quah of the London School of Economics. So I would invite you to look at the map of that. Search Danny Quah, Q-U-A-H, and it's a whole map of how the tilt of power economically is going east to India and China. The UAE saw after 2008, it's a plan they had in place, but they just needed to accelerate it because of the financial crisis. I think it's worth sharing just a few things, and then we could take some questions. We don't say it's all about oil, but oil plays a very major factor. If you look at global demand today, it's around 98 million barrels a day on a daily basis. 31 million of that goes to Asia. Of the growth in oil, we are talking about growth demand every day of 1.4 million barrels a day. You've heard this figure, 2017. 1 million of that is coming from Asia, and most of it's coming from China, India, South Korea, and Japan. So if you missed it, you should go back and look, but King Salman's trip to Asia lasted a month, and it was taking place while it was in China. He started in Malaysia and Indonesia. He signed $13 billion worth of oil and gas deals in Malaysia and Indonesia. He took a holiday in between, went to Brunei, went to the Maldives, and then finished up in Japan and Tokyo. So we talk about hard and soft power. In the next year, we're going to see the IPO of Saudi Aramco, worth $2 trillion valuation. They want to list some of that probably in Tokyo. Theresa May would like to have that listed in London. Of course, Donald Trump would like to have some of it listed in New York. So everybody's fighting over the listing of Saudi Aramco. Shanghai offered a little bit of support as well. So you can see, again, at the heart of this relationship is natural resources, but the exchange is investment exchange with Tokyo, Beijing, Shanghai, and then stretching to the west to London and New York. So watch it really carefully because it's strategically important. And then I've got some other notes, but one other point I wanted to make. My wife, who's here today, Manuel, and I took a trip to Kenya a month ago for the spring break. And I've read time and time again about the relationship between Africa and China and the role China is playing in Africa. You never understand it until you actually visit. So we were in Kenya, went into Nairobi, drove 2 hours to Lake Nakuru, 2.5 hours, and then to the Masai Mara, which if you haven't done, you have to do for incredible. But the bridges and the roads that were being built, I thought, that is an extraordinary bridge being built. China Road and Development Construction Company building the road and the rail. They're doing a wide gauge rail or a standard gauge rail to cut the trip from Mombasa to Nairobi from 12 hours on train down to 4.
With the new international airports, is exclusively by China.
Exactly. So an airport's being built, the road network's being built. It's connecting South Sudan to Kenya, going to Uganda. So there's a couple of amazing figures that are out there that you should pay attention to, I think. $130 billion are being spent on transportation infrastructure, and another $200 billion will be built and spent in Africa between now and 2025. So it said, and this is a quote from Ken Curtis, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, for China looking to reduce its trade dependence on the West, even China wanting to reduce exposure to the West, these regions are key to further its objectives. With Chinese investment leading the way, they will see vast development over the next 2 decades. Ken Curtis now of Stratford Investments and the former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia. But the other thing he said to me, John, you have to pay attention to what China's doing. China's looking for key strategic hubs that have trade ports. So they picked Mombasa, using the financial capital of Nairobi, and they picked Dubai and Abu Dhabi as their regional hub of the Middle East. So this country should be very proud of that, establishing the relationship. But China's very smart because it's the sort of infrastructure it needs.
And they do need a long-term plan.
Yes,
to
and they
carry
think
it
in
out.
probably 25 to 50-year cycles.
This is the size of the country, you
Yeah.
have to.
The final thought, geopolitically for China, which I think it's worth noting, and a number of the leading analysts that I've spoken to, Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group is a very young, 40-year-old man, but a very bright mind when it comes to geopolitics, and written a number of books if you're interested in this. But he said China wasn't ready to step on the global arena. It was kind of forced to step onto the global arena because of what we see with Russia today, particularly what we see with the dislocation of Europe and the Brexit, and what we particularly see in the United States with a leader like Donald Trump. China, if it had its way, would do its economic investment for the next 15, 20 years and leave the politics to somebody else. But it's stepping up to the stage now because it has to.
It's amazing also to see how politics and political decisions having influence at the economic level.
Yes,
with other
at
countries.
all times.
Yes, at all times.
Okay.
Would like to open the floor questions, if you don't mind. I think Hannah.
That's okay. Do we need a headset as well, or is it
Yeah, I was sure.
in English or in Arabic?
No, actually in English.
Okay,
Hi,
thanks.
it
Thank you
was
very
an interesting lecture. Thank you so much for introducing us to what's happening around us from a professional point of view. And my question, usually empires, they rise and fall, depends on their military power, economic power. And now we see that as if we are witnessing a shifting in power to the east, as you mentioned, John. And I want to see, at this point, I'm scared about the States. I feel like with how we say, like with a closure to the inside, inward, and with the openness of the others, the world is going definitely to witness a new era. So where do you see it, when do you see it coming?
Okay. It's a great question.
Thank you.
I'm not a military strategist, but I think I can jump into this. I talked about Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group, and I did an interview with him at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he's written a book about the G0 world. It just came out about 6 months ago. And G0, he means that we had the infrastructure of the G7, and then the G8 with Russia in it. We expanded that during the financial crisis to include the G20. The G20 is almost dead because A, it's too big, but B, I don't think the West is willing to share power with India and China economically. That's the challenge. So that's one point. So in this G0 world, you have competing forces at the same time. So you have China stepping up prematurely because I don't think it really wanted to do so. We see Vladimir Putin flexing his muscles like never before. So a major force to reckon with. Donald Trump saying we're going to focus on America first, but at the same time putting aircraft carriers in the Korean Peninsula because he wants to put a cap on North Korea. China coming a little bit closer to the United States trying to deal with the Korean problem. Japan was on the sidelines for 10 years because it was not growing, but we see the emergence of Shinzo Abe and the relationship with the United States. This is probably the most dangerous time we have witnessed in 50 years as a result of what you're talking about, because there's no one distinct leader in the world. So we have to get used to this idea that there's no one unipower anymore. After the US foray into Iraq and the $1 trillion war and the mess that it created here, there's a reluctance by the United States to engage in a full-fledged conflict and be the flame carrier, the torchbearer around the world. So in this period of the US slight retreat from the world because it spent so much time and effort in Iraq, the rise of China economically, the rise of Russia militarily, and a 7-year war taking place in Syria, it's a pretty dangerous window. I know exactly what you feel like, and we sit in the Middle East in a harbor of peace with a lot of chaos around us, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I pray to God that Syria is going to find a solution, that a solution can be found to Syria, and I hope there's an ability for Iran to emerge with transparency, with its military plans, so it can have an economic development that stabilizes the region, and that we actually see a relationship emerge without tension. I interviewed the Minister of Energy in Iran 6 months ago. I went to Iran twice in the last 6 months. And he said to me, mark my words, in 5 years we'll be exporting natural gas to Saudi Arabia. So it's possible. We can bury our differences. We have an economic dependence on each other. Saudi Arabia will need natural gas in the future. So
I think that economic needs are going to prevail over political.
It could.
It could. But I have to join Hanad in her concern. What you said is that you have a number of global leaders reacting to each other. Don't you think when they react, it's a premature reaction? For how long they can sustain that?
Sure. Well, I think there's multiple forces. I've had this conversation with my wife, and we include our daughters in this conversation as well, because I think it's the most important thing that's taken place in the last 25 years. I think we need to connect the dots of what's taken place in 25 years. We had the fall of communism, so it unleashed a great deal of change, followed up 3 years later by the creation of the World Trade Organization. We lowered barriers to bring the communist states in. We probably lowered those barriers too quickly, but it's very hard to manage a revolutionary movement such as communism. You lower trade barriers, it intensifies competition, and 3 years later we had a digital revolution on top of it. So within a span of 7 years, you had the fall of communism, development of the World Trade Organization in a much bigger way than before, and a digital revolution that put power at the hands of everybody. And I think we're very reactionary today because of the digital revolution and watching everything on social media. They used to have a backdoor conversation between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and nothing would come out of it because besides the diplomacy, right? Now it's within an hour, it's circled the world twice. Syria, with Hafez al-Assad and the crushing of many thousands of people in the past, we never saw. We bear witness to the crisis and the tragedy of Syria on a daily basis, right? And that's what has changed it. It's amplified it in such a big way. It makes the leaders not lead for the long term, but to be much more reactionary. And back to your question, I think it makes it much more, a much more nervous environment for us to live in. I mean, I watch the tweets coming from Donald Trump, and I watch our coverage that comes out of that. You know, hour by hour policy sometimes changes, and it makes it unsettling. It's a whole new reality that we're living in today.
Any question?
Mr. John, it's honor.
Thank you for your invitation.
No, it's honor for me.
It took us 3 years to do it, but I'm glad it happened. I was only an attendee before, so thanks.
My honor, you be here, and the honor for Al-Multaqa also to be here, and for the book fair also, the third honor. My question, the new train between Europe to Asia, to China, it will affect Jabal Ali, I think. It's what's about, I'm talking about this area directly. How you think from your vision about that?
I don't worry about Jabal Ali or the port of Khalifa at all, actually, to be honest with you.
It's by train, you know. It's
yes, but I did see that, yes.
First, they will short the time.
Yes.
Second, easily. Third, less economically.
Yes.
That's why I want to know from your vision.
That's a great point. I've been watching the development of the train. It's to connect the Central Asia to Europe, bypassing any port whatsoever, and to connect it by train. I think it'll be good for European Union goods going to Central Asia. To be brutally honest, Central Asia is not a huge economy on its own. There's not that many consumers. So I don't see it displacing Jabal Ali whatsoever. After you have a $70 billion trade relationship with India, and I noted that China will be the most important trading partner with the Middle East, I think those relationships have been forged, but I actually think it's good for Central Asia, even the One Belt, One Road strategy, Asma. I think it's excellent to get these less developed economies, which are fervent in that tie to a radical Islam in some of those states. It's really smart for us to get them to develop. Countries like Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to open up to the outside world. It's really important. So I think more connections, the better, because it'll foster development, which is sorely needed.
Because before we believe about the globalization, sorry my English, and
That's
with
okay.
the تجارة الحرة يسمونه free trade, and you know when they start to make it free trade, it's effective to many people. One of affecting in our country, if they coming and they be the whole economic, it will affect me because the population we are less, and also we don't have this experience, and we are not in all the world around us.
Yes.
That's why I think how is effect in that. I'm sure it will affect us in train.
Well, a couple of things here. I had this conversation with His Excellency Sultan Al Mansour. He is one of your brightest minds here in the UAE, your Minister of Economy, very solid, well-educated man. And he said after that experience in 2008, 2009, we realized that we need to diversify, so not be overly dependent on the West. But number two, we are like Singapore. We are a globalized economy. We die without globalization. So it's a lot of pressure, and we've been talking about it editorially since I've been here full-time for the last 6 years. It's a lot of pressure on a society, and I commend the Emirati people, to deal with a population when you're the minority. It's not easy. I can understand exactly what you're saying. But look at the benefits of being a globalized economy. You're the financial center of the Middle East. You are the connector of the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Asia as an airport. The port of Jebel Ali does 2/3 of the traffic taking place in the Middle East, and it's going to grow. It's got a great new infrastructure with the Port Khalifa. And then you see strategic projects that most people don't pay attention to that are really smart, like the pipeline from Abu Dhabi going to Fujairah. It's incredibly smart. $3 billion investment. All the uncertainty that surrounded the Strait of Hormuz for the last 50 years in oil has been removed, because you can export south of the Strait of Hormuz to Fujairah. It helps develop Fujairah, so it'll globalize Fujairah in its own sweet way, but it has open access to Asia now to trade. So I wouldn't be so worried about it. The thing we have to worry about is that the next generation's prepared for globalization, Asma. The education system that's been set up, and the language skills, and the ability to get trained overseas and to come back again, I think is vital, because it's not easy to be 5 or 10% of your entire population. I understand it, but the UAE has benefited a great deal. Look at the change that Saudi Arabia is trying to go through now. They waited, and it's a big change that's taking place in Saudi Arabia economically with the Deputy Crown Prince's 2030 plan with King Salman. It's a huge change. But I came here in 1991, and this place is unrecognizable to what it is today. In 1991, I did a story about Dubai becoming the Hong Kong of the Middle East.
That's what very inspiring.
1991. And I remember Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, who was the Minister of Defense back then. He says, it's nice that you said Hong Kong, but actually we're the Singapore, because that's where we got the model. So you know the story with Mohammed Al-Alabar. He was trained in Singapore for 8 years. He talked to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid and said, I think we should use a Singaporean model for free zones. And they developed that for all of the UAE now. It's not just a Dubai strategy, it's a much broader strategy to be globalized and engaged to the outside world. And the Silk Road and the Spice Route have a lot to do with it today. Good. Thanks.
Question?
Yes. We have his microphone up, please. Ellie? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for all what you said, and there is a lot of wealthy information. We get it. Thank you very much. Not far away from the first question, in the end of last century, everybody remember that what is the CNN, especially in Kuwait war. What is the media? By all, what is the media? Media is what creating the world. Media is making our life. This is what I know, even in advertising and everything. Now, in the end of this time, I think because of social media, or there is another reason. For example, let us talk about Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is against the media. Not in all, but he is not shy to be against. Before any president in the world, he care about small media. Small, especially CNN is something not small. Now, do you think that now the power of media is going to reduce, by the day because of social media or because of another things, or people they doesn't trust anymore with the international media or the total media, CNN or others, of course, I mean. What is the reason you think that not anymore people care about the biggest channels in the world, like your channel, of course?
The biggest what, sorry?
Channels.
Oh, channels. Let me answer your question then.
Yeah.
I think we're, as I mentioned before, we're almost to the previous question about a political revolution. It's connected. We're in a digital revolution. I talked about it and the impact it's had after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the lowering of trade barriers. The digital revolution has completely changed our business in the last 5 years. So, number one, what has survived in the last 5 years in this process are the major brands. Everybody always says, I really feel sorry for CNN because Donald Trump has said fake news, you know, CNN, the fake news channel. Our ratings and our revenues have never been higher. So everybody has a worry about CNN and where it stands today. You don't need to worry about CNN. And the brands that do particularly well online are the brands you trust. So CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the Arabic versions, Gulf News, Arab News. The biggest brands end up getting the biggest traffic. But the reality is to think that we live in a TV-only world where it's appointment viewing only on television. If I said that was the case today, I'd be joking myself. So what's going to happen in the next 5 years after the last 5 years? Everybody that's holding a smartphone is going to be watching their TV show in a much more reduced version. 2, 3, the same clips I showed you today also go up on Twitter today. They also go on our websites today, and they go on your mobile phones today. So CNN has completely revolutionized in the last 5 years, and we're only getting started. So we go out in the field. I work with the digital reporters all the time. Sometimes it's a 1-minute story, 2-minute story. But the appointment viewing for a half hour or an hour-long show, CNN will still do that. But the revolution that's going to take place on your mobile phone and your iPad or smart devices is going to radically change. But what has already changed, to your point, social media has changed the way we cover things. We watch what's the most trending subjects on Twitter. Of course we watch what's active. I see in 15 seconds what breaking news is taking place in Saudi Arabia or in Syria. So the social revolution has already taken place, the social media revolution. It'll compete forcefully. I think the strongest, most trusted brands are the ones that will survive, because you're not going to trust every source that's out there. It's just a reality. In the Arab world or in Asia, it's a very level field, but it's the bigger brands will survive, but we're completely changing the way we cover news.
No, that's for sure. There is even some studies that had been done about viewership attitude. And once you develop your trust in a certain media channel, even at the time of this agreement with a certain editorial line of the channel, the viewership was not affected. And this Al Jazeera was an example during the what's so-called the Arab Spring. Despite the difference in agreement with Al Jazeera, their viewership was not affected. So yes, as John said, we will diversify our access to news, but it will depend also on the media, on the channel, to what extent they are coping with the change to be able to preserve their quota of viewership, I would say.
The other point I would make, I'll just give you a sense in the last 5 years what's happened, the way we cover things. You know, I go to an OPEC meeting, like energy is one of the things I cover, right? We used to have a satellite truck there. Very expensive, $10,000 a day to have a satellite truck. Then we moved to the laptop on broadband. So we could use the broadband on a laptop to broadcast live into CNN. Now we have a device called the Live View. It used to be a backpack with 7 SIM cards attached to it. That backpack is now shrunk to a deck like this that they still carry in a backpack, and I can go live from anywhere as long as you have a mobile phone network that's 4G. Within instance, 15 seconds later, you're on the air. So the OPEC meeting finishes, a minister comes out, you tell them, I have the minister, he's right here, let's go live immediately. There's no satellite truck, you know, book the satellite. You don't spend thousands of dollars doing it, it's on your backpack and you're ready to go. And your digital reporter's right next to you at the same time. So it's a revolution like never before. But at the end of the day, I don't know how you guys feel, I'm an ardent follower of the Financial Times. I love reading my newspaper every weekend. It's fantastic, but I have to be journalists and institutions that I trust. And we're going through a period of dislocation, but I think the cream rises to the top. You have to trust the brands. I'm not just saying English brands, of course, but the brands in your language that you can really rely upon, I think is vital. And it's not propaganda. I just think it's reality.
Any questions?
Yeah, I think we are running. I don't want to go forever, but for you, for the
Last
next
question
speaker.
from Sima, and when we close.
Experience shows that there was a lot of cases that economic drive is being had a bridge gap, a lot of the political and geopolitical issues. Now, obviously, there are a lot of bubbling things happening here in the Middle East. How you see or how you foresee the challenges that would be as a World Economic Forum media leader with the economic drive and the issues that happening in this part of the world?
What do you mean by the question? No, sorry, what's the relationship?
All the political raising issues, what's happening, do you think the economic, obviously experience shows that the economic drive is stronger than the political drive, but how do you foresee it as a leader in this part of the world?
Well, everybody engages and then retreats from the Middle East. I think this would be the worst time for us to retreat. You heard the United States saying, we're going to scale down our presence in the Middle East and we're going to pivot to Asia for exactly the same reason you were talking about, because of the growth. I think it's a mistake for everybody to retreat from anywhere. We had a tendency to turn a blind eye to ISIS in the darkest pockets of Africa, where the weakest, they're like a cancer. They go into the weakest economies. So there's a direct link between economic development, military stability, and political stability. So you have to have these all working in unison. The world's not perfect. It doesn't work that way. So I would hope, and I don't mean to be with the rose-colored glasses, as we say, we should look at these problems much faster. We shouldn't let it fester as it did for years. In the weakest parts of Africa, we let it fester for years. In the weakest parts of the Middle East, we let it fester for years. And now the problem's been a huge one, and we're getting a grip on it. But it's caused a lot of dislocation. The US thought it was going to retreat to the Middle East. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm very curious to see what happens with the sanctions regime in Iran at the end of June. You have to watch it very carefully. I'd much rather have Iran in the global tent, as Saudi Arabia suggested, and somebody you can negotiate with, as opposed to pushing them out of the tent. I'd much rather have them engaged. And I'd rather much see the power not concentrated in the hands of the military in Iran, and much more developed middle class. That economy has so much potential, I can't tell you. 80 million people, well-educated, mineral resources, natural gas and oil. Growth and development is much more important than having proxy wars around us. And I think that would be a strategic thing for us to do, is to see Iran develop in a peaceful way. It would be phenomenal for the region. It would solve a lot of problems. Yeah.
We close. Thank you. There is a last question.
Thanks. I think should be the last. That's
Yeah.
from Peters. We have to take.
Yeah, we have to take this one. Last question.
Great talk, John. Thank you. I wanted to share with you and with everyone here something that I just learned the way we learn news. I'm reading something from the New York Times on my iPhone.
There you go.
The New York Times reports that Facebook is now the largest and most influential entity in the news business, with an audience greater than that of any American or European television news work, any newspaper or magazine in the world. So we may sit here thinking we're all getting news from CNN, but more people are getting news from Facebook.
Well, that's good and bad, because it's a fantastic distribution platform for CNN and others. But it's only obvious with 1.3 billion users. Of course, it's going to have the biggest audience in the world. I think we have to wake up to realize what's being fed through Facebook. We learned that during the last election. So what's being fed into Facebook, and Facebook should become like a news channel with constant streaming of news from the New York Times, from Middle Eastern publications, and from natural sources or in the field. A conglomeration of things. We'll find out what was actually fed into. But even Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook said we have to be much more careful of what goes up on Facebook in the future. But it's got a fantastic audience, and I don't mean to be a revolutionary, but with an audience of better than 1 billion people, it should have a lot more video content. Yeah. So there's a great future for us as well in that space as a TV and digital channel. Does that make sense?
There is some picking up from the
for sure, for sure. The synergies are obvious. Yes.
Yeah.
We're taking more questions. Okay.
Just a small question, very
Okay.
small question. Journalists are exposed to hidden secrets. When you think you can reveal some of all, how many years it will take, or if even you are allowed to do that?
Okay, this is that's a good question. Great question. It's under the context of off the record. So having been here for 6 years and covered the region for 20 years, I finally, even though I'm 56 years old, I finally realized that it's the relationship you have with people that helps you break news. Yeah? Exactly. So the best way to do it is not hold it for years, but if somebody tells you something off the record, it's your job as a journalist to go find 3 sources that can confirm what's reality. So nothing stays secret for too long. They tell you on off the records they can give you guidance. They're not against you reporting, but they want you to verify it with other sources. And I ask my sources, are you okay if I go verify this elsewhere? And if they say yes, I go verify it elsewhere. So they want you to know what the real story is so you don't go reporting something else. A perfect example of that was the electronic ban on the laptops. Yes. And you know, I got to give a lot of credit to the folks that are based here, but Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways, incredibly professional. The media team stayed in constant contact with me. They said, this is on the record and this is what we're trying to do. This is off the record and this is what we hope it happens in the next 2 to 3 months. So they gave me the information I could report on the day and that week, and then gave me guidance for the next 2 or 3 months what they were hoping to get accomplished at the same time. That's very clever communication strategy and having a relationship with the individuals to be able to do that. You have to have the give and take. I mean, His Excellency Suhail Mazrui, although he's a pretty young Minister of Energy, one of the youngest within OPEC, if not the youngest, very smart man, but he gives fantastic guidance of what's happening in the oil and energy market, so we're not reporting the wrong thing. So some of it's off the record and some of it we can work with. And when they're ready to go on the record, they go on the record. That makes sense?
But I meant years back, like when you were in the Gulf Air, with Berlin. I'm not talking about now. It's about the years back when you had some secrets.
Right. I didn't have any secrets that I haven't reported, let's put it that way. But I should have woken up, say, in 1988. I was a young reporter at 27, and I was in East Berlin in 1988, a year before the wall came down. And the IMF and the World Bank held a meeting in Berlin for a reason, because they knew the wall was going to come down a year later. They didn't know exactly when, but as a young journalist, we should have said, why are they here in the IMF and the World Bank? So they know what's going on. They can see the trend. They see the forces at play. The timing is not always exact. I had people tell me in 2001 that something like the Arab Spring was going to happen. They just didn't know when. They didn't know what the flashpoint was going to be. And they told me in 2001, 2002, they're extremely worried. And it took 10 years to happen. It does happen, but it's not an exact science when it's going to happen. 10 years ago, we were talking about peak oil. Nobody talks about peak oil today. It's a big difference. Yeah, exactly. Thanks for your invitation again. I don't want to step on the next speaker, but thanks a lot for your help. Rada, thanks for being such a nice host.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for an extremely interesting talk. Fascinating. Thank you everyone for your attendance. I think we have for me, it's really fascinating.
Something we have to watch.
Really, definitely open my eyes to a lot of things.
Very much so. Thank you. Thanks for giving me something that's so good.